Yeah, so thanks to the Global Labor Research Center and CAWLS for putting this together and giving us something to be motivated by and keep us working. It means a lot, and thanks to everybody for taking the time to come and watch a lot of familiar faces and names, and that's all. It's just always nice to see, but especially now with everything that's going on. My paper is entitled "We Can't Just Wrap Ourselves in the Flag: Collective Action Frames, Context Appropriate Power, and the 21st Century Fight Against Deindustrialization." I wanted to work on this paper to get better acquainted with the power resources approach, and also to give me a chance to sort of pull together what I have so far and one of my case studies in terms of research. And that case study is Unifor Local 222, and specifically its members at GM Oshawa. And that research includes a small series of semi-structured interviews I did with 222 leaders and activists back in November of 2017. The title of my paper is a reference to the title of a 2001 paper by Stephen High called "I'll Wrap the Effing Flag Around Myself: A Nationalist Response to Plant Closures." The title of his paper invokes the defiance with which the Canadian wing of the UAW split from their American counterparts over deep disagreements about concessions, militancy, and more fundamentally, perhaps, about union democracy. In it, High argues that a sort of new nationalism emerged in response to plant closures in Ontario throughout the 70s and 80s, and that this nationalism provided a powerful mobilizing tool that helps to account, at least in part, for Canadian unions' sustained strength relative to their American counterparts throughout the period. He's careful not to overstate how successful these efforts were, because in fact they failed most of the time. Usually enhanced severance or early retirement packages were about the best they could squeeze. And in most of those cases, it's important to remember that it wasn't just nationalist campaigning, but also direct action in the form of plant occupations that did win those small concessions. Despite the inability of these campaigns to deliver on the promise of keeping good jobs in Canada, large industrial unions like Unifor have remained basically unmoved in their commitment to the approach. And in this paper, what I'm trying to do is work through why the approach has been so unsuccessful, or at least what lessons we can learn from that lack of success by applying a sort of power resource approach. You're probably sitting there thinking, Chris, Unifor just won $1 billion investment to keep Oshawa open. How can you call it a failure? Well, you got me. There's a lot we don't know yet about the agreement, and I think that the recent history of these kinds of successes encourages us to proceed with caution. In 2016, the union secured $500 million to keep Oshawa open, and it was less than 2 years later that GM was announcing it would close. So obviously, I haven't been able to contend much with this development in the paper itself, but I'm happy to talk about it in the Q&A after if we have time. The power resource approach has become a fairly popular way of trying to explore why certain strategies work while others fail. And in preparing this paper, I've been really influenced by a recent book by Marissa Brooks, in which she develops her theory of coordination and context-appropriate power. And the theory basically holds that unions succeed when they make use of power resources which are appropriate for the given context, and when they coordinate those efforts appropriately as well within and outside the union. She builds on earlier interventions by Wright and Silver, which began to divide up and categorize different kinds of power resources. Workers derive different kinds of power from the fact that they and their employers are embedded in different kinds of systems. So workers have power at the point of production and in the workplace based on the fact that employers depend on them to get things done. Workers that are highly skilled or work in workplaces that are difficult to relocate tend to have additional structural power compared with those that are easier to replace. We tend to think of globalization as having weakened industrial workers' power by enhancing capital's ability to pit workers against each other. But it's also enhanced worker power in certain circumstances. Dock workers pose a more imminent threat to global capital should they strike, especially coordinated across many ports simultaneously. And the nature of just-in-time production means that even small disruptions can spread quickly through an entire supply chain. Workers and bosses are also enmeshed in complex legal and regulatory environments, giving unions a kind of institutional power, which is usually accessed through grievance procedures, through courts, arbitration, mediated settlements, etc. And so both unions and capital have an incentive to try to have those laws changed. And an increasing reliance on institutional power probably means unions would tend to spend more time not just on legal fights, but on convincing politicians to change the rules. And in the literature, this is something called governance struggles. Employers also rely on networks of other actors, including vendors and customers, and workers will often try to exploit that by leveraging forms of what's called coalitional power. Coalitional power involves the direct creation of formal coalitions, but also includes efforts to convince anyone outside the employment relationship to take action and put pressure on the employer. Petitions to governments for favorable actions, public relations campaigns designed to shame an employer or tarnish a brand, calling on consumers or other firms to boycott specific products. These are all examples of coalitional power. And then finally, there's power in collective action itself. In the literature, this is called associational power. It comes from the fact that workers are organized and pulling in the same direction. Associational power significantly enhances the other forms of power. Individual workers have fairly limited structural power, but by working together, their structural power is obviously much greater. And if workers spread across a firm's entire network are organized and working together, they should have substantially greater structural power than individual bargaining units or local unions do. Understood this way, we might think of building solidarity between Canadian and Mexican auto workers not as an expression of coalitional power, but rather as an attempt to expand this more fundamental form of associational power, because international solidarity in this kind of case is not so much about putting public pressure on the employer, but about restoring the structural power of workers along an entire operation. So what can we learn from this framework by applying it to this case study? Well, Unifor Local 222 is one of those locals that's been severely undermined by globalization. GM has taken great advantage of their ability to move production from one place to another, and its footprint in Ontario has been steadily declining since the 1980s. Prior to this sort of free trade era of the late 80s, there were 17,000 unionized jobs at GM Oshawa, and by 2016, that was down to just a few thousand. 2016 turned out to be a really important year for the union because this was the year that not only was there no guaranteed product allocated to Oshawa at the end of that collective agreement, but 2016 was also the last year that GM would be required to maintain at least 16% of its North American production in Canada as a condition that was imposed in the 2008 bailout agreement. Local leadership decided there'd have to be some kind of campaign, and the local political action committee was tasked with putting together that campaign. It was initially branded GM Oshawa Matters, and the campaign included a very successful social media strategy, routine banner drops at local 401 overpasses, efforts to convince politicians to put pressure on GM. Banners read, "Keep good jobs in Canada." They also read, "GM going to China and Mexico." And members were given shirts which read, "Canada didn't bail out GM for them to invest in Mexico." The union also asked local businesses to display signs reading "GM Oshawa Matters," and members of the union made hand-made lawn signs with written messages about how the plant mattered to Oshawa. As I said, GM did, in the end, promise to invest $500 million in the facility, but within months, there were layoffs at a different GM facility in Oshawa. And by November 2018, the announcement was made that GM Oshawa would in fact close by the end of 2019. When that announcement was made, the campaign quickly sprang back into life. It was rebranded as the Campaign to Keep GM Oshawa Open. Many of the tactics remained the same, but the framing had changed in two significant ways. The campaign tried as much as possible not to center on the competition between Canadian and Mexican workers. And in fact, they tried to highlight the importance of their shared struggle as a basis for solidarity. The campaign was also no longer calling on politicians to force GM to stay open. Instead, they were calling for the government to nationalize the plant and use it to manufacture social goods like electric vehicles. And eventually, the campaign was rebranded as Green Jobs Oshawa, and that campaign is still ongoing. At the same time, Unifor National launched its own campaign called Save Oshawa GM. The campaign also included overtures for government action, but the principal thrust of the campaign was to build a public perception of GM as a greedy corporation that had betrayed the city of Oshawa, which is true. The union called on members and consumers to boycott Mexican-made GM vehicles, and they brought Sting to Oshawa to perform in solidarity with the workers. The union also filed a grievance based on their belief that closing the plant violated the terms of the 2016 agreement. The national campaign was called off in March of 2019 due to promising negotiations with GM. And a few months later, it was announced that some 300 jobs would stay in the plant, as it transitioned away from assembly towards part stamping and autonomous vehicle testing. Saving even a small number of jobs in the face of a closure is a significant feat, and there's no doubting that, but it's little consolation to the thousands of people who lost their jobs. There are substantial economic and social impacts for their families and the rest of the community as well. So I think we need to ask, is this the best we could have hoped for? And certainly I don't think so. If we accept that unions win when they choose context appropriate power resources and coordinate those efforts effectively, the shortcomings of the nationalist approach start to become clear. I think Hai is correct in that creating a national community of interest has served as an effective mobilizing tool for unions. But over time, I think we've also seen how easy it is for employers to creep into that community of interest. This framing allows us to believe that what's in GM's best interest is in the workers' best interest, because keeping the plant open and employing people becomes the very top priority. This kind of thinking has over time caused the union to abandon its very principled no concessions stance. And some of the concessions that they made have undermined the ability of the union to put up as strong a fight as possible later. So in 2008, GM offered incentive packages to encourage more senior workers to retire. One of the activists I interviewed described how this left a bit of a leadership vacuum as more seasoned activists and union reps retired. And the union also accepted at one point a two-tiered employment scheme, which not only undermined solidarity on the shop floor, at least in the view of the folks that I interviewed, but also required the expense of substantial bargaining leverage later to try to correct, and that's leverage that obviously could have been exerted elsewhere. The nationalist framing, in tandem with declining structural power, has led the union to adopt strategies with specific kinds of power resources. Rather than building associational power with auto workers abroad in hopes of restoring their structural power, the union tries to leverage more institutional and coalitional forms premised on the importance of good Canadian jobs. These strategies are increasingly at odds with the context of 21st century capitalism in North America. Calling for a boycott of Mexican-made vehicles and more generally enhancing the value of domestic automobiles as a marketing tool is a gift not only to GM, but manufacturers like Toyota and Honda. Folks might have seen the ads that Honda is now running that say, they're built here by folks that understand what it's like to drive here. And the highly integrated nature of North American auto industry makes it very clear that, or makes it very difficult, to deduce what a Mexican-made vehicle even is. Research has shown that auto parts cross borders as many as 8 times before they end up in the final assembly. Canada exported $1.2 billion in auto parts to Mexico in 2018. Obviously, there are downstream effects of boycotting Mexican vehicles for Canadian workers and potentially for some of the 17,000 uniform members who work in independent auto parts. I'm going to skip right to my last thing to say because I realize that I'm running out of time. In order to renew worker power in the industry, I think the unions need to focus on organizing the unorganized workplaces in assembly and parts, and needs to start taking far more seriously the need to build not just solidarity, but active coordination with workers in Mexico and the United States. And to steal a quote from a local 222 member, Tony Leah, who is here, in my opinion, the greatest weaknesses so far are 1, not seeing workers' ability to stop production as key, and 2, ignoring the need for solidarity from the rest of the labor movement in Canada and solidarity with auto workers in the US and other countries. And I'll stop there. Thanks.